God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. Wherever the Jesuits appeared, there was quickly seen a manifest revival of the popish faith. In the short space of 10 years, their establishment had flourished in all the countries in which they were planted. Their system of education was adapted to all classes. While they studied the exact sciences and strove to rival the most renowned of the Protestant professors, and so draw the higher youth into their schools, they compiled admirable catechisms for the use of the poor. They especially excelled as teachers of Latin, and so great was their zeal and their success that even Protestants removed their children from distant schools to place them under the care of the Jesuits. The teachers seldom failed to inspire the youth in their schools with their own devotion to the popish faith. The sons of Protestant fathers were drawn to confession, and by into great general conformity to popish practices. Food which the Church had forbidden, they would not touch on the interdicted days, although it was being freely used by the other members of the family. They also began to distinguish themselves by the use of popish symbols. The wearing of crosses and rosaries is recorded by Ranke as one of the first signs of the setting of the tide toward Rome. Forgotten rites began to be revived. Relics which had been thrown aside and buried in darkness were sought out and exhibited to the public gaze. The old virtue returned into rotten bones, and the holiness of faded garments flourished anew. The saints of the Church came out in bold relief, while those of the Bible receded into the distance. The light of candles replaced the word of life in the temples. The newest fashion of worship were imported from Italy, and music and architecture in the style of the Restoration were called in to reinforce the movement. Customs which had not been witnessed since the days of their grandfathers began to revive the reverent observance of the new generation. In the year 1560, the youth of Ingolstadt, belonging to the Jesuit school, walked 2 and 2 on a pilgrimage to Eichstätt, in order to be strengthened for their confirmation by the dew that dropped from the tomb of St. Walpurgis. The modes of thought and feeling thus implanted in the schools were, by means of preaching and confession, propagated through the whole population. While the Jesuits were busy in the seminaries, the Pope operated powerfully in the political sphere. He had recourse to various arts to gain over the princes. Duke Albert V of Bavaria had a grant made him of 1/10 of the property of the clergy. This riveted his decision on the side of Rome, and he now set himself with earnest zeal and marked success to restore, in its ancient purity and vigor, the popery of his territories. The Jesuits lauded the piety of the Duke, who was a second Josias, a new Theodosius. The Pope saw clearly that they could never hope to restore the ancient discipline and rule of their church without the help of the temporal sovereigns. Besides Duke Albert, who so powerfully contributed to re-establish the sway of Rome over all Bavaria, the ecclesiastical princes, who governed so large a part of Germany, threw themselves heartily into the work of restoration. The Jesuit Canisius, a man of blameless life, of consummate address, and whose great zeal was regulated by an equal prudence, was sent to counsel and guide them. Under his management they accepted provisionally the edicts of the Council of Trent. They required of all professors in colleges subscribe to the confession of the popish faith. They exacted the same pledge from ordinary schoolmasters and medical practitioners. In many parts of Germany, no one could follow a profession till first he had given public proof of his orthodoxy. Bishops were required to exercise a more vigilant superintendence of their clergy than they had done these 20 years past. The Protestant preachers were banished, and in some parts the entire Protestant population was driven out. The Protestant nobles were forbidden to appear at court. Many withdrew into retirement, but others purchased their way back by a renunciation of their faith. By these and similar arts, Protestantism was conquered on what may be regarded as its native soil. If not wholly rooted up, it maintained henceforward but a languishing existence. Its leaf faded, and its fruit dried in the noxious air around it, while Romanism shot up in fresh strength and robustness. A whole century of calamity followed the entrance of the Jesuits into Germany. The troubles they excited culminated at last in the 30 Years' War. For the space of a generation, the thunder of battle continued to roll over the fatherland. But the God of their fathers had not forsaken the Germans. It pleased him to summon from the distant Sweden Gustavus Adolphus, and by his arm to save the remnants of the Protestant liberty in that country. Thus the Jesuits failed in their design of subjugating the whole of Germany, and had to content themselves with dominating over those portions, unhappily large, of which the ecclesiastical princes had given them possession at the first. Chapter 9. Commercial Enterprises and Banishments. England, Poland, Cardinal Hosius, Sigismund III, Ruin of Poland, Jesuit missions in the East Indies, number of their converts, their missions in Abyssinia, their kingdom of Paraguay, their trading establishments in the West Indies, episode of Father Lavalette, bankruptcy, trial, their constitutions brought to light, banished from all popish kingdoms, suppressed by Clement XIV, the Pope dies suddenly, the order restored by Pius VII, the Jesuits, the masters of the Pope. Of the entrance of the Jesuits into England, the arts they employed, the disguises they wore, the seditions they sowed, the snares they laid for the life of the sovereign, and the plots they concocted for the overthrow of the Protestant Church, we shall have an opportunity of speaking when we come to narrate the history of Protestantism in Great Britain. Meanwhile, we consider their career in Poland. Cardinal Hosius opened the gates of this country to the Jesuits. Until then, Poland was a flourishing country, united at home and powerful abroad. Its literature and science during the half-century preceding had risen to an eminence that placed Poland on a par with the most enlightened countries of Christendom. It enjoyed a measure of toleration which was then unknown to most of the nations of Europe. Foreign Protestants fled to it as a refuge from the persecution to which they were exposed in their native land, bringing to their adopted country their skill, their wealth, and their energy. Its trade increased, and its towns grew in population and riches. Italian, German, French, and Scottish Protestant congregations existed at Krakow, Vilna, and Poznania. Such was Poland before the Jesuit foot touched its soil. But from the hour that the disciples of Loyola entered the country, Poland began to decline. The Jesuits became supreme at court. The monarch, Sigismund III, gave himself entirely up to their guidance. No one could hope to rise to the state who did not pay court to them. The education of the youth was wholly in their hands, and the effects became speedily visible in the decay of literature and the growing decline of the national mind. At home the popular liberties were attacked in the persons of the Protestants, and abroad the nation was humiliated by a foreign policy inspired by the Jesuits, which drew the contempt and hostility of neighboring powers upon the country. These evil courses of intrigue and faction within the country, and impotent and arrogant policy outside of it, were continued until the partition of Poland resulted. It is at the door of the Jesuits that the fall of that once enlightened, prosperous, and powerful nation is to be laid. It concerns us less to follow the Jesuits into those countries which lie beyond the boundaries of Christendom, unless in so far as their doings in these regions may help to throw light on their principles and tactics. In following their steps among heathen nations and savage races, it is alike impossible to withhold our admiration of their burning zeal and intrepid courage, or our wonder at their prodigiously rapid success. No sooner had the Jesuit missionary set foot on a new shore, or preached, or by an interpreter it might be, his first sermon in a heathen city, than his converts were to be counted in tens of thousands. Speaking of their missions in India, Sacchinus, their historian, says that 10,000 men were baptized in the space of 1 year. When the Jesuit mission to the East Indies was set on foot in 1559, Torres procured royal letters to the Portuguese viceroys and governors, empowering them to lend their assistance to the missionaries for the conversion of the Indians. This shortened the process wonderfully. All that had to be done was to ascertain the place where the natives were assembled for some religious festival, and surround them with troops of soldiers, who, with leveled muskets, offered them the alternative of baptism. The rite followed immediately upon the acceptance of the alternative, and the next day the baptized were taught the sign of the cross. In this excellent and summary way was the evangelization of the island of Goa effected. By similar methods, they attempted to plant the popish faith and establish their own dominion in Abyssinia, and also at Mozambique, 1560, on the opposite coast of Africa. One of the pioneers, Oviedo, who had entered Ethiopia, wrote thus: the Pope, he must be permitted to inform His Holiness that, with the assistance of 500 or 600 Portuguese soldiers, he could at any time reduce the empire of Abyssinia to the obedience of the pontificate. And when he considered that it was a country surrounded with territories abounding with the finest gold, and promising a rich harvest of souls to the Church, he trusted His Holiness would give the matter further consideration. The Emperor of Ethiopia was gained by flatteries and miracles. A terrible persecution was raised against the native Christians. Thousands were massacred, but at last, the king having detected the authors of these barbarities plotting against his own life and throne, they were infamously expelled from the country. Having secured the territory of Paraguay, a Portuguese possession in South America, the Jesuits founded a kingdom there, and became its sovereign. They treated the natives at first with kindness, and taught them several useful arts, but by and by they changed their policy, and reducing them to slavery, compelled them to labor for their benefit, dealing out to the Paraguayan peasant, from the produce of his own toil, as much as would suffice to feed and clothe him. The fathers laid up the rest in large storehouses, which they had erected for the purpose. They kept carefully concealed from the knowledge of Europe the seemingly exhaustless source of wealth, that no one else might share its sweets. They continued all the while to draw from it those vast sums wherewith they carried on their machinations in the old world. With the gold wrung from the Paraguayan peasants' toil, they hired spies, bribed courtiers, opened new missions, and maintained that pomp and splendor of their establishments by which the populace were dazzled. Their establishments in Brazil formed the basis of a great and enriching trade, of which Santa Fe and Buenos Aires were the chief depots. But the most noted episode of this kind in their history is that of Father Lavalette, 1756. He was Visitor General and Apostolic Prefect of their missions in the West Indies. He organized offices in San Domingo, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and other islands, and drew bills of exchange on Paris, London, Bordeaux, Nantes, Lyon, Cadiz, Leghorn, and Amsterdam. His vessels loaded with riches, comprising, besides colonial produce and Negro slaves, crossed the sea continually. Trading on credit, they professed to give the property of the society as security. Their method of business was abnormal. Treaties obeyed by other merchants they disregarded. Neutrality laws were nothing to them. They hired ships which were used as traders or privateers as suited them, and sailed under whatever flag was convenient. At last, however, came trouble to these fathers, who were making, as the phrase is, the best of both worlds. The brothers Leonci and Gaufrey of Marseille had accepted their bills for 1.5 million livres, to cover which 2 vessels had been dispatched for Martinique with merchandise to the value of 2 million. Unfortunately for the fathers, the ships were captured at sea by the English. The house of Leonci and Gaufrey asked the superior of the Jesuits in Marseille for 4,000 livres as part payment of their debt, to save them from bankruptcy. The father replied that the society was not answerable, but he offered the brothers the aid of their prayers, fortified by the masses which they were about to say for them. The masses would not fill the coffers which the Jesuits had emptied, and accordingly the merchants appealed to Parliament, craving a decree for payment of the debt. The appeal was allowed, and the Jesuits were condemned to honor the bills drawn by their agent. At this critical moment, the general of the society died. Delay was inevitable. The new general sent all the funds he could raise, but before these supplies could reach Marseille, Leonci and Gaufrey had become bankrupt, involving in their misfortune their connections in all parts of France. Now that the ruin had come and publicity was inevitable, the Jesuits refused to pay the debt, pleading that they were protected from the claims of their creditors by their constitutions. The cause now came to a public hearing. After several pleas had been advanced and abandoned, the Jesuits took their final stand on the argument which, in an evil hour for themselves, they had put forth at first in their defense. Their rules, they say, forbade them to trade, and the fault of the individual members could not be punished upon the order. They were shielded by their constitutions. The Parliament ordered these documents to be produced. They had been kept secret till now. They were laid before the Parliament on the 16th of April, 1761. The result was disastrous for the Jesuits. They lost their cause and became much more odious than before. The disclosure revealed Jesuitism to men as an organization based on the most iniquitous maxims, and armed with the most terrible weapons for the accomplishment of their object, which was to plant their own supremacy on the ruin of society. The disclosure of their constitutions were one of the principal grounds of the decree for the extinction of the order in France in 1762. It is not to be wondered that political kingdoms and civil communities should feel the order a burden too heavy to be borne, when we reflect that even the popes, of whose throne it was established, have repeatedly decreed its extinction. Strange as it may seem, the first bolt, in later times, that fell on the Jesuits was launched by the hand of Rome. Benedict IV, by a bull issued 1741, prohibited them from engaging in trade and making slaves of the Indians. In 1759, Portugal, finding itself on the brink of ruin by their intrigues, shook them off. This example was soon followed in France, as we have already narrated. Even in Spain, with all of its devotion to the Papal See, all of the Jesuit establishments were surrounded, one night in 1767, with troops, and the whole fraternity, amounting to 7,000, were caught and shipped off to Italy. Immediately thereafter, a similar expulsion befell them in South America. Naples, Malta, and Parma were the next to drive them from their soil. The severest blow was yet to come. Clement XIII, hitherto their firm friend, yielding at last to the unanimous demands of all the Roman Catholic courts, summoned a secret conclave for the suppression of the order, a step necessary, said the brief of his successor, in order to prevent Christians rising one against another and massacring one another in the very bosom of our common mother, the Holy Church. Clement died suddenly the very evening before the day appointed for the conclave. Lorenzo Gaganelli was elevated to the vacant chair under the title of Clement XIV. Gaganelli was studious, learned, of pure morals, and of genuine piety. From the schoolmen he turned to the Fathers. Forsaking the Fathers, he gave himself to the study of the Holy Scriptures, where he learned on what rock to fix the anchor of his faith. Clement XIV strove for several years, with honest but mistaken zeal, to reform the order. His efforts were fruitless. On the 21st day of July, 1773, he issued the famous bill, Dominus Ac Redemptor Noster, by which he dissolved and forever annihilated the order as a corporate body, at which time it counted 22,000 members. The bull justifies itself by a long and formidable list of charges against the Jesuits. Had this accusation proceeded from a Protestant pen, it might have been regarded as not free from exaggeration, but coming from the papal chair, it must be accepted as the sober truth. The bull of Clement charged them with raising various insurrections and rebellions, with plotting against bishops, undermining the regular monastic orders, and invading pious foundations and corporations of every sort, not only in Europe, but in Asia and America, to the danger of souls and the astonishment of all nations. It charged them with engaging in trade, and that, instead of seeking to convert the heathen, they had shown themselves intent only on gathering gold and silver and precious jewels, and had interpolated pagan rites and manners with Christian beliefs and worship. They had set aside the ordinances of the Church and substituted opinions which the Apostolic Chair had pronounced fundamentally erroneous and evidently subversive of good morals. Tumults, disturbances, violence had followed them in all countries. In fine, they had broken the peace of the Church, and so incurably that the pontificates of his predecessors, Urban VIII, Clements 9, 10, 11, and 12, Alexander's 7 and 8, Innocent's 10, 11, 12, and 13, and Benedict XIV had been passed in abortive attempts to reestablish the harmony and concord which they had destroyed. It was now seen that the peace of the Church would never be restored while the order existed, and hence the necessity of the bull which dispossessed the Jesuits of every office, service, and administration, took away from them their houses, schools, hospitals, estates, withdrew all their statutes, usages, decrees, customs, and ordinances, and pronounced all the powers of the general, provincial, visitors, and every other head of the same order, whether spiritual or secular, to be forever annulled and suppressed. The present ordinance, said the bull, in conclusion, shall remain in full force and operation from henceforth and forever. Nothing but the most tremendous necessity could have made Clement XIV issue this bull. He knew well how unforgiving was the pride and how deadly the vengeance of the society, and he did not conceal from himself the penalty he should have to pay from decreeing its suppression. On laying down his pen, after having put his name to the bull, he said to those around him that he had subscribed his death warrant. The Pope was at that time in robust health, and his vigorous constitution and temperate habits promised a long life. But now dark rumors began to be whispered in Italy that the pontiff would die soon. In April of the following year he began to decline without any apparent cause. His illness increased. No medicine was of any avail, and after lingering in torture for months, he died. September 22nd, 1774, several days before his death, says Caraccioli, his bones were exfoliated and withered like a tree which, attacked at its roots, withers away and throws off its bark. The scientific men who were called in to embalm his body found the features livid, the lips black, the abdomen inflated, the limbs emaciated and covered with violet spots. The size of the heart was diminished, and all the muscles were shrunk up, and the spine was decomposed. They filled the body with perfumed and aromatic substances, but nothing could dispel the mephitic effluvia. The suppression with which Clement XIV smote the Society of Jesus was eternal, but the forever of the bull lasted only in actual deed during the brief interval that elapsed between 1773 and 1814. That short period was filled up with the awful tempests of the French Revolution, to the fallen thrones and desecrated altars of which the Jesuits pointed as the monuments of the divine anger at the suppression of their order. Despite the bull of Clement, the Jesuits had neither ceased to exist nor ceased to act. Amid the storms that shook the world, they were energetically alive. In revolutionary conventions and clubs, in war councils and committees, on battlefields they were present, guiding with unseen but powerful touch the course of affairs. Their maxim is, if despotisms will not serve them, to demoralize society and render government impossible, and from chaos to remodel the world anew. Thus the Society of Jesus, which had gone out of existence before the Revolution, as men believed, started up in full force the moment after, prepared to enter on the work of molding and ruling the nations which had been chastised but not enlightened. Scarcely had Pius VII returned to the Vatican when, by a bull dated August 7, 1814, he restored the Order of Jesus. Thaddeus Borzadzowski was placed at their head. Once more the Brotherhood stalked abroad in their black berettas. In little time their colleges, seminaries, and novitiates began to flourish in all the countries of Europe, Ireland and England not excepted. Their numbers, swelled by the sodality of St. Vincent de Paul, Brothers of the Christian Doctrine, and other societies affiliated with the order, became greater, perhaps, than they ever were at any former time. Their importance was vastly enhanced by the fact that the contest between the order and the papal chair ended, temporarily at any rate, in the enslavement of the popedom, of which they inspired the policy, indited the decrees, and wielded the power. Chapter 10. Restoration of the Inquisition. Failure of the Ratisbon Conference. What next to be done? Restore the Inquisition. Paul III. Carafa. His history. Spread of Protestantism in Italy. Juan de Valdez. His reunions at Chiaja. Peter Martyr Vermigli. Bernardino Ochino. Galeazzo Caracoli, Vittoria Colonna, etc. Pietro Carnesecchi, etc. Shall Naples or Geneva lead in the reform movement? There's one arm of the Jesuits to which we have not yet adverted. The weapon that we refer to was not indeed unknown to former times, but it had fallen out of order, and had to be refurbished, and made fit for modern exigencies. A substantial part of the Jesuits' success was owing to their use of it. That weapon was the Inquisition. We have narrated in a former chapter the earnest attempt made at the Conference of Ratisbon to find a basis of conciliation between the Protestant and the Popish churches. The way had been paved at Rome for this attempt to reconcile the two creeds by an infusion of new blood in the College of Cardinals. Gaspar Contarini, a senator of Venice, who was known to hold opinions on the doctrine of justification differing very little, if at all, from those of Luther, was invested with the purple of the college. The chair of the Doge almost within his reach, Contarini was induced to come to Rome and devote the influence of his high character and great talents to the doubtful experiment of reforming the papacy. By his advice, several ecclesiastics whose sentiments approximated his own were added to the Sacred College, among others Sadoleto, Giorberto Carafa, and Reginald Pole. In the end, these new elections but laid a basis for a more determined and bloody resistance to Protestantism. This was in the future as yet. Meanwhile, the reforming measures for which this change in the cardinalate was to pave the way were taken. Deputies were sent to the Ratisbon Conference, with instructions to make such concessions to the reformers as might not endanger the fundamental principles of the papacy or strip the tiara of its supremacy. The issue was what we have announced in a previous part of our history. When the deputies returned from the Diet and told Paul III that all their efforts to frame a basis of agreement between the two faiths had proved abortive, and that there was not a country in Christendom where Protestantism was not spreading, the Pope asked in alarm, "What then is to be done?" Cardinal Carafa and John Alvarez de Toledo, Bishop of Burgos, to whom the question was addressed, immediately made answer: re-establish the Inquisition. The proposal accorded well with the gloomy genius, unbending opinions, and stern bigotry of the men from whom it came. Carafa and Toledo were old Dominicans, the same order to whom Innocent III had committed the working of the Holy Tribunal when it was first set up. Men of pure but austere life, they were prepared to endure in their own persons, or to inflict on the persons of others, any amount of suffering and pain, rather than permit the Roman Church to be overthrown. Re-establish the Inquisition, said Carafa. Let the Supreme Tribunal be set up in Rome, with subordinate branches ramifying over all Europe. Here in Rome must the successors of Peter destroy all the heresies of the whole world. The Jesuit historians take care to tell us that Carafa's proposal was seconded by a special memorial from the founder of their order, Ignatius Loyola. The bull re-establishing the Inquisition was published July 21st, 1542. The Holy Office, revived with terrors unknown in former ages, had now a plenitude of power. Its jurisdiction extended over all countries, and not a man in all Christendom, however exalted in rank or dignity, was but liable to be made answerable at its bar. The throne was no protection, the altar was no shield. Withered age and blooming youth, matron and maiden, might at any hour be seized by its familiars, and undergo the question in the dark underground chamber, where, behind a table, with its crucifix and taper, sat the Inquisitor, his stern, pitiless features surmounted by his black cowl, and all around the instruments of torture, till the most secret thought had been wrung out of the breasts. No mercy was to be shown. For one inquisitor to feel the least pity for his writhing victim was to debase himself. Such were the instructions drafted by Carafa. The history of the man who restored the Inquisitions is one of great interest, and more than ordinary instruction, but it is touchingly sad. Carafa had been a member of the Oratory of Divine Love, which was a little circle of moderate reformers that held its sittings in the Trastevere at Rome, and occupied, as regarded the reform of the Roman Church, a position midway between the champions of things as they were and the company of decided adherents of the gospel, which held its reunions at Chiaja in Naples, and of which we shall speak below. Carafa had tasted the good word of God and the powers of the world to come, but the gracious stirrings of the Spirit and the struggles of his own conscience he had quelled, and from the very threshold of rest which he was seeking in the gospel, he had cast himself again into the arms of an infallible church. With such a history, it was not possible that Carafa could act a middle part. He threw himself with sterner zeal into the dreadful work of reviving the Inquisition than did even Paul III, under whom he served, and whom he was destined to succeed. Carafa, says the historian Ranke, lost not a moment in carrying this edict into execution. He would have thought it a waste of time to wait for the usual issue of means from the apostolic treasury, and, though by no means rich, he hired a house for immediate proceedings at his own expense. This he fitted up with rooms for the officers and prisons for the accused, supplying the latter with strong bolts and locks, with dungeons, chains, blocks, and every other fearful appurtenance of its office. He appointed commissioner generals for the different countries. The resolution to restore the Inquisition was taken at a critical moment for Italy and all the countries south of the Alps. The dawn of the Protestant day was breaking around the very throne of the Pope. From the city of Ferrara in the north, where the daughter of Louis XII, the correspondent of Calvin, sheltered in her palace the disciples of the gospel, to the ancient Parthenope, which looks down from its fig and aloe-covered heights upon the calm waters of its bay. The light was breaking in a clearness and fullness that gave promise that in proportion to the depth of the previous darkness, so would be the splendor of the coming day. Distinguished as the land of the Renaissance, Italy seemed about to become yet more distinguished as the land of Protestantism. At the foot of the Fezzole, and in that Florence on which Cosmo and the brilliant group of scholars around him had so often looked down, while they talked of Plato, there were men who had learned a better knowledge than that of which the Greek sage had taught. In Padua, in Bologna, in Lucca, in Modena, in Rome, and in other countries of classic fame, some of the first families had embraced the gospel, men of rank in the state and of eminence in the church, persons of mark in the republic of letters, orators, poets, and some noble ladies, as eminent for their talents as for their birth, were not ashamed to enroll themselves among the disciples of that faith which the Lutheran princes had confessed at Augsburg, and which Calvin was propagating from the little town on the shore of the Leman, then beginning to attract the notice of the world. But of all the Protestant groups now forming in Italy, none equaled in respect the brilliance of rank, luster of talent, and devotion of faith than that which gathered around Juan de Valdez on the lovely shore of Naples. This distinguished Spaniard had been forced to leave the court of Charles V and his native land for the sake of the gospel. On the western arm of the Bay of Naples, hard by the tomb of Virgil, looking forth on the calm sea and the picturesque island of Capri, with the opposite shore, on which Vesuvius, with its pennon of white vapor atop, kept watch over the cities which 1400 years before it had wrapped in a winding sheet of ashes, and enclosed in a tomb of lava, was placed the villa of Valdez. There his friends often assembled to discuss the articles of the Protestant creed, and confirm one another in their adherence to the gospel. Among these was Peter Martyr Vermigli, prior of St. Peter's ad Aram, and in the wilderness of Romanism the prior had become parched with thirst, for no water could he find that would refresh his soul. Valdez led him to a fountain, whereat Martyr drank, and thirsted no more. In his turn he zealously led others to the same living stream. Another member of that Protestant band was Caserta, a Neapolitan nobleman. He had a young relative, then wholly absorbed in the gaieties and splendors of Naples. Him Caserta introduced to Valdez. This was Galeazzo Caracoli, only son of the Marquis of Vico, who embraced the gospel with his whole heart, and when the tempest dispersed the brilliant company to which he had joined himself, leaving his noble palace, his rich patrimony, his virtuous wife, his dear children, and all his flourishing honors, he cleaved to the cross, and repairing to Geneva was there, in the words of Calvin, content with our littleness, and lives frugally according to the habits of the commonalty, neither more nor less than any one of us. In 1536 the Select Society received another member. Bernardino Ochino, the great orator of Italy, came at that time to Naples to preach the Lent sermons. A native of Siena, he assumed the cowl of St. Francis, which he afterwards exchanged for the frock of the more rigid order of the Capuchins. He was so eloquent that Charles V said of him, "That man is enough to make the stones weep." His discourses were impregnated with the great principles of the Protestant faith, and his eloquence drew overwhelming crowds to the church of St. Giovanni Maggiore, where he was now preaching. His ascension to the society around Valdez gave it great additional strength, for the preacher was daily scattering the seeds of divine truth among the common people, and not among these only, for persons of all ranks crowded to hear the eloquent Capuchin. Among his audience might be seen Julia de Gonzaga, widow of the Duke of Trajetto, reputed the most beautiful woman in Italy, and, what was higher praise, one of the most humble and sincere of its Christians. And there was Vittoria Colonna, Marchioness of Pescaro, also renowned for the loveliness of her person, and not less renowned for her talents and virtues. And there was Pietro Carnesecchi, a patrician of Florence, and a former secretary of Clement VII, now a disciple, and afterwards to be a martyr of the gospel. Such were the illustrious men and the high-born women that formed this Protestant proponent in Naples. It comprehended elements of power which promised brilliant results in the future. It formed a galaxy of rank, talent, oratory, genius, and tact, adapted to all classes of the nation, and constituted, one would have thought, such an organization or bureau as was sure to originate and in due time accomplish the Reformation of Italy. The ravages of the Gothic nations had inflicted, and the yet greater ravages of the papacy were on the point of being repaired, and the physical loveliness which Italy had known in her first days, and a moral beauty greater than she had ever known, were about to be restored to her. It was during those same years that Calvin was beginning his labors at Geneva, and fighting with the pantheistic libertines for a secure foothold in which to place his Reformation, that this little phalanx of devoted Protestant champions was formed on the shore of Naples. Of the two movements, the southern one appeared at that hour much the more hopeful. Contemplated from a human point of view, it had all the elements of success. Here the flower of an ancient nation was gathering on its own soil to essay the noble task of evoking into a second development those mighty energies which had long slumbered, but were not dead, in the bosom of a race that had given arts and letters and civilization to the West. Every needful power and gift was present in the little company here confederate for the glorious enterprise. Though small in numbers, this little host was great in names, comprehending as it did men of ancient lineage, of noble birth, of great wealth, of accomplished scholarship, of poetical genius, and of popular eloquence. They could appeal, moreover, to a past of renown, the traditions of which had not yet perished, and the memory of which might be helpful in the struggle to shake off the yoke of the present. These were surpassing advantages compared with the conditions of the movement at Geneva, a little town which had borrowed glory from neither letters nor arms, with a population rude, lawless, and insolent, a diminutive territory overshadowed on all sides by powerful and hostile monarchs, who stood with arm uplifted to strike down Protestantism should it here raise its head, and, most discouraging of all, the movement was guided by but one man of note, and he a stranger in exile, without the prestige of birth or rank or wealth. The movement at Geneva cannot succeed. That at Naples cannot fail. So would we have said. But the battle of Protestantism was not to the strong. The world needs to have the lesson often repeated, that it is the truth of principles and not the grandeur of names that gives assurance of victory. The young vine planted beneath the towers of the ancient Parthenope, and which was shooting forth so hopefully in the golden air of that classic region, was to wither and die, while that which had taken root beneath the shadow of the Alps was to expand amid the rude blasts of the Swiss mountains, and stretch its boughs over Christendom. Chapter 11. The Tortures of the Inquisition. A stunning blow. 3 classes in Italy. Flight of Peter Martyr Vermigli, of Ochino, Carafa made Pope. The martyrs, Molio and Tiserano. Italian Protestantism crushed. A notable epoch. 3 movements. The Inquisition at Nuremberg. The torture chamber. Its furnishings. Max Tower. The chamber of question. The various instruments of torture. The subterranean dungeons. The Iron Virgin. Her office. The burial of the dead. The re-establishment of the Inquisition decided the question of the Reformation of Italy. The country, struck with this blow as it was lifting itself up, instantly fell back into the old gulf. It had become suddenly apparent that religious reform must be won with a great fight of suffering, and Italy had not strength to press on through chains and dungeons and scaffolds to the goal she wished to reach. The prize was glorious, she saw, but the price was great. Pallavicino has confessed that it was the Inquisition that saved Italy from lapsing into Protestantism. The religious question had divided the Italians of that day into 3 classes. The bulk of the nation had not thought of the question at all, and harbored no purpose of leaving the Church of Rome. To them, the restoration of the Inquisition had no terrors. There was another large class who had abandoned Rome, but who had not clearness to advance to the open profession of Protestantism. They were most to be pitied of all should they fall into the hands of the inquisitors, seeing they were too undecided either to decline or to face the horror of the Holy Office. The third class were in no doubt as to the course they must pursue. They could not return to a church which they had held to be superstitious, and they had no alternative before them but provide for their safety by flight, or await death amid the fires of the Inquisition. The consternation was great, for the Protestants had not dreamed of their enemies having recourse to such violent measures. Numbers fled, and these fugitives were to be found in every city of Switzerland and Germany. Among these was Bernardino Ochino, on whose eloquent orations all ranks of his countrymen had been hanging but a few months before, and in whose audience the emperor himself might be seen when he visited Italy. Not, however, till he had been served with a citation from the Holy Office at Rome did Ochino make his escape. Flight was almost as bitter as death to the orator. He was leaving behind him the sense of those brilliant triumphs which he could not hope to renew on a foreign soil. Pausing on the summit of the great St. Bernard, he devoted a few moments to those feelings of regret which were so natural on abandoning so much that he could not hope ever again to enjoy. He then went forward to Geneva. But alas, the best days of the eloquent monk were past. At Geneva, Ochino's views became tainted and obscured with the new philosophy, which was beginning to air itself at that young school of pantheism. Peter Martyr Remigli soon followed. He was presiding over the convent of his order in Lucca, when the storm came with such sudden violence. He set his house in order and fled, but it was discovered after he was gone that the heresy remained, although the heretic had escaped. His opinions having been embraced by many of the Lucchese monks, the same was found to be the case with the order to which Ochino belonged, the Capuchins namely, and the Pope at first meditated, as the only cure, the suppression of both orders. Peter Martyr went ultimately to Strasbourg, and a place was found for him in its university, where his lamp continued to burn clearly to the close. Juan de Valdez died before the tempest burst, which drove beyond the Alps so many of the distinguished group that had formed itself around him at Posillipo, and saw not the evil days which came on his adopted country. But the majority of those who had embraced the Protestant faith were unable to escape. They were immured in the prisons of the various holy offices throughout Italy. Some were kept in dark cells for years, in the hope that they would recant. Others were quickly relieved by martyrdom. The restorer of the Inquisition, the once reforming Carafa, mounted the papal chair under the name of Paul IV. The rigors of the Holy Office were not likely to be relaxed under the new pope, but 20 years were needed to enable the torture and the stake to annihilate the Protestants of Italy. Of those who suffered martyrdom, we shall mention only two: Molio, a Bolognese professor, renowned throughout Italy for his learning and his pure life, and Tiserano, a native of Perugia. On the 15th of September, 1553, an assembly of the Inquisition, consisting of 6 cardinals with their episcopal assessors, was held with great pomp at Rome. A train of prisoners, with burning tapers in their hands, was led before the tribunal. All of them recanted, save Molio and Tiserano. On leave being given them to speak, Molio broke out, says Macri, in a strain of bold and fervent invective, which chained them to their seats, at the same time that it cut them to the quick. He rebuked his judges for their lewdness, their avarice, and their bloodthirsty cruelty, and concluded as follows: "Wherefore I appeal from your sentence, and summon you, cruel tyrants and murderers, to answer before the judgment seat of Christ at the last day, where your pompous titles and gorgeous trappings will not dazzle, nor your guards and torturing apparatus terrify us. And in testimony of this, take back that which you have given me." In saying this, he threw the flaming torch which he held in his hand on the ground, and extinguished it. Galled, and gnashing upon him with their teeth, like the persecutors of the first Christian martyrs, the cardinals ordered Molio, together with his companion, who approved of the testimony he had borne, to instant execution. They were conveyed accordingly to the Capo del Fiore, where they died with the most pious fortitude.